Hi, everybody. It's Carol Clark, and we are here for another episode of Build the Weight Loss Practice of Your Dreams. And I actually have a returning guest. It's been a little while since Shelly's been with us, but I have Shelly Smith, who is the owner of Premier Rapport. And she does a lot of really interesting things, and she's got some great perspectives that I think really help the practices that I work with or anyone who's dealing with change, which can bring a lot of different emotions and situations that occur in a practice. So we're going to talk all things change today, and I'm going to let Shelly do a little introduction of herself, and then we will go ahead and dive in. Shelly?
Well, I am thrilled to be here today and be back today, so I certainly appreciate that. So yeah, change is on both of our minds. It's amazing how much change we go through on a daily basis, and sometimes we, accept it, and sometimes it scares us to death, and it kind of shuts us down. So I look forward to the conversation today.
Right. And just so our listeners know, because you also do, she's really known as the culture curator and all things culture, and actually you do a daily podcast, don't you?
I do. It's called The Morning Commute, and then the longer one. So the Morning Commute is just a little snippet to kind of get your energy focused. And it's a culture constant, if you will. And then the culture hour is a little longer one that I do occasionally.
Yeah, it's good stuff. All right. Well, let's dive right in.
All right.
So what sort of advice do you have? I work with practices, do some consulting, and we do a lot of different things that will involve change. And some of the common changes that we can see in a practice relate to a change in, we add additional services, or a new physician may be coming into the practice. Those are just a couple of the pretty common ones that occur. And of course, it creates lots of different feelings, as you mentioned, fear, anxiety, where do I fit in, that sort of thing. How can we help our team not only navigate this change, but also, learn to sort of embrace it and help make it a more positive experience?
Yeah, I think, some of us embrace change better than others. So the first thing is the preference would be to assume that people do not like change. So, which is not the case. I happen to embrace change. I love it. I thrive against it or with it. However, most people do not. So number one is, regardless of your viewpoint, is to assume that change is not a friend to those that you're working with or for, so vertically or horizontally. So the first thing to do is communication strategy is so important. I cannot stress that enough. So especially when it's monumental changes in staffing, organization, additional revenue streams, things that are really going to tug and sort of pull at people from a day-to-day functionality and or make them feel insecure about what's happening, why is it happening. So number one is put together a communication strategy. And I don't want that to be daunting to the listeners. I'm just thinking simple things. I mean, ask yourself, if you didn't know what was going on, if you weren't the driver of the change, what are some questions you might have? And just write those down on a notebook. Why are we doing the change? Why are we implementing XYZ? Why are we going to even update something as simple as maybe how we answer the phone or how we do an intake with a new client? So think about the questions that you personally would have, and then start to bring people in that you also know a little bit about what's about to come on, and ask them what kind of questions they would have. That will help you formulate the initial communication strategy for the immediate parties that need to know. And then ultimately, typically your entire staff needs to know what's going on. And that also includes even some of your ongoing clients, depending on the type of practice that you actually have. So I'm going to stop and pause there. That would be tip number one, communication strategy.
Right. So communication, I agree with that. And I've always been one of those leaders who believes that communication is a really good thing, and that people perform better when they are informed, just like our patients make better decisions when they are informed of the options available to them. So I think communication is a big thing. What do you recommend for the leader who may keep things a little bit more, close to the chest or close to the vest, however the saying goes, but kind of likes to keep it kind of more private, and then versus involving more people? Is there a way that they can then they can help, communicate that in a more effective, that's comfortable for them, in terms of sharing that information. Because I know probably most everyone who's listening has been in a situation where when things aren't said, all of a sudden a rumor mill starts to churn, and then things go crazy. Things come out that aren't even intended or on the radar. So how do you help with managing that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So number one, again, you start with asking yourself, hate to be repetitive, but asking yourself what information you might want to know or what you might assume if you didn't know,
Mhm.
especially, like you said, we want to prevent things going sideways. So making a list of what are the changes going to entail,
Right.
at what point that will help you if you're being guarded with, kind of spoon feeding that information,
Mhm.
asking yourself who needs to know, when do they need to know, and how am I going to tell them? So, starting with that list of all the moving parts, we'll begin to say, well, who in the office is going to need to know? And you can
Right.
start to think through who's it going to affect, make that list. When do they need to know? You could think about when do they need to order product or service, or is it a renovation, or are they going to need to interview or onboard? So, depending on what those changes are, it helps you begin to not only your confidence of that transparency, and then it's okay to let people know, but then also you're doing it very proactively. You're actually creating the expectation of what the change is going to be, and you're controlling what that change is going to be. And then guess what? If the rumor mill starts, say that three
Mhm.
times in a row, and things start to go sideways, you're already prepared because you've already thought through it. And you could quickly go to your go-to list, your guide about the rollout plan and say, okay, I was going to wait until next week, but listen, let's go ahead and talk about it now. But let's
Right.
also talk about why I didn't tell you. So it wasn't because I didn't think you weren't seen, valued, and heard. It's that I actually was doing this very intentionally. And it's okay to talk about yourself, to say, so that I'm a guarded individual, or as a whole, I usually don't tell everything that's going on. So I am intentionally letting people know it's not that I don't value you, it's not that I don't trust you, but
Mhm.
there was reasons for, and I hope that you respect that. I just didn't go out and make a blanket email to the staff or on
Right.
changes. Does that help a little bit? So
That does, because I do think, people respect honesty and a little bit of, sharing a little bit of rationale for why you're doing what it is that you're doing.
yes.
So sometimes what happens is, I'll give you a couple scenarios if you could help work through this, because I know you work closely with teams to help them manage in situations like this. But occasionally I'll come into a practice and we'll be adding retail sales.
Mhm.
And there can be a sort of a dichotomy, so to speak. I'll have a group of people who are so pumped about it, and they're like, our patients need this. They ask about it. They're buying stuff at places where, other places we could provide them with such better products. We could teach them how to use and integrate it. And then there's this like split of the other people who approach it in a different way, and part of its personality, I know, but it's more of a fear factor. It's going to change my job, it's going to add more work. I think I don't know sales, I have to be salesy. So there's these like two different group, so to speak. And so having to then merge them into one cohesive team. Do you have any tips for how to handle that? Since I think that's something that the listeners do run into, whether it's adding retail sales or whether it's adding another practitioner in the practice or another service line or something like that.
Yeah, no, and that probably happens more often than not, right? We've got the
Yeah.
early adopters, and then we have the ones that are just, it doesn't mean that they're not bought in. They're just
Mhm.
not ready yet, right? We haven't created the buy-in. So I'm a huge believer in small focus groups. So I think that you can kind of split intentionally. You can either mix those two groups together, or you
Mhm.
can intentionally split those groups. My recommendation is you split those groups into the early adopters, the ones that are like, get it, get it, get it, got it, got it, got it, and give them some tasks and ways to start creating. What does it look like? What do you need? What are your suggestions? And then as they start to create some list and momentum, then I would engage the other group and say, hey, listen, what are we missing? What are we not thinking about it? You know, kind of what's going through your
Right.
mind. And you actually would want to give that to them in writing from a checklist, process flow, however, to allow them to think about it. And don't be surprised if they would prefer to give you one-to-one feedback instead of group feedback, because that could add to the fear too. They may not be as expressive in a group,
Right.
but they'll begin to check in and see that you're not going to go so fast that you're going to run over them, and that you really do value what it is that they think, and that you
Mhm.
really want their perspectives too. But you'll just have to do it in a more deliberate manner. So again, asking very specifically, you know, what do you think about this line of product or service? You know,
Right.
why do you think people go to Walmart to get their supplies versus if we had those supplies here? You know, what kind of questions do you think, or are you hearing now when, you know, people are sitting and talking or on the phone or what have you? So
Mhm.
bringing them in far more deliberate
Sure.
and calmer, instead of the group that's really all in it, just kind of let them go and then come aside and work with them more on an individual basis. And use words like, it's really important that I get your buy-in in this. It's really important that I really feel like I'm missing something. And, you know, you're a very detailed, deliberate person. What are we not asking? What are we
Right.
not thinking about? If you were one of our clients coming back in, what would you think or say or do, or what might? And it doesn't mean that you have to have everybody at 100% agreement, but what it means is you're allowing everybody to be heard at the
Mhm.
speed in which they want to be heard. So that would be my suggestion around that.
Okay. Um, I understand that. I totally get that. I think people do react better when they're included in that whole sort of process. What do you recommend sometimes when you're doing something like that? It's a change, and so you know, as a leader, you're always looking at who your team is, where they're best suited, and what needs to get accomplished, and what's the best way to take my team and accomplish this goal. And so sometimes when you're integrating something new, you may or may not need additional staff, but sometimes that's the first thing that comes up. So initially you'll have something new you're on, so it's like, well, we can't possibly do that unless we bring on a new team member. We need some more staff to be able to manage that. Whereas oftentimes you can actually creatively adjust workloads, and be able to accomplish the same thing, at least to trial it that way before you throw more resources at it, especially when you want to make sure it's a profitable new endeavor, and you're trying to make sure that you can join things and not just throwing resources at it. You want to make sure that you go about that a little bit cautiously. Do you have any recommendations for how to manage that when that's the first thing that comes to you, bringing in a new service or adding a service line?
Absolutely. I actually do this type of work with clients all the time who go through any type of structural reorganization. And
Mm-hmm.
again, we'll go back to how we opened up, you know, just that fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
So pulling together a task force, I'll take you from an A to Z. So when somebody's going through a reorg, which ideally that's what we're talking about, this bringing in retail, for example, could be a reorg. So from there, I actually will do one-on-one interviews with the leaders, the decision makers. And then from there, I'll do group interviews based on what it is that I heard, just to talk
Mm-hmm.
about what's working, what's not working. If you could literally redo the whole thing, what is it you would do and how would you do it? And then from there, I come up with themes. And then usually out of the themes, you'll come up with task force, and then you throw out the task force, you know, to the group and say, who wants to be on it? Who would like to be on it, but maybe also lead it? And so then you find the people who are really interested. They're either the early adopters and they're really jazzed up, or they're so interested that they want to participate and they just want to know a little bit more, but they're a little bit
Mm-hmm.
guarded. And then the task force begin to happen. You give them guidelines and you say, literally create it from scratch. You know, it's almost like saying, here's your Lego blocks. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to give you what it is you need to build or how you need to build it, but you tell us what needs to be built. And out of that, you get people looking at job descriptions as they are now and saying, you know what, it's never made sense that I did blah, blah, blah. I think maybe we should shift this over to and maybe have a group of people who are capable of doing this, or this should be a new position. And or they come up with, if we pull these things out, then I can be more customer service focused, and I will fill my time, instead of doing paperwork, I can fill my time on the phone or talking to clients when they come in. But then this is going to create 2 more jobs. And these are the suggested duties we think, we as in the task force think, that person would need to do. And then you get to a stopping point where the task force or the task force leader comes back to the owner and says, this is what we came up with. So it just creates this whole beautiful buy-in, and allows people to, number one, talk about their fears of, well, what's it going to do if you pull that off? What am I going to do? Well, you love talking to the clients. You don't ever get to call people back like you want to every month. Wouldn't that be great? Oh, right. Yeah. And so it opens up all those possibilities. The key thing is, you may not implement, and you probably won't implement everything that the task force group comes up with, but you will be able to do 1, 2, 3, or 4 things out of that. And then they're, again, really going to feel seen, valued, or heard. So now the next time you do something, their guard's going to be right where you want it to be, and they're going to be really comfortable giving you the opinion. So that's, again, best practice. I happen to do it all the time, in the midst of doing that with a client right now. 3 different task force groups. One task force has 5 people, one has 2 people, one has 10, and we've split off into subgroups. And so the size doesn't matter. They all volunteered, and they got in it, and they're redesigning. They're creating pools of people to do jobs that were dedicated people before, aligned to service. And then one of them is they're creating 3 new jobs. So it's fascinating to see people when you're able to take your job description and go, it's never made sense for me to do that. And if I didn't have to do that anymore, what would I do? Right.
And then maybe you end up with things that that lend better to their talent level too, Can you back up a second to when you talked about themes? Can you give us a few examples of what do you mean by that was a higher level step in your process? When you talked about themes, what specifically, can you give us a few examples or what that means?
Well, regardless of organization structure, it's always interesting that communication always comes up. And so I usually have a task force that is around how do we communicate. So when you talk about the communication strategy, so that particular group will put together how and when and what we actually communicate XYZ to the rest of the group. And day-to-day things. Another example would be if you have an office that's got, for example, multiple support functions that are really administratively driven, and let's say they're dedicated to, depending on the size of the office, they're dedicated to a particular doctor. So let's say there's 3 doctors in a particular office. So maybe each doctor has a dedicated person. So out of that, a theme could be, instead of having a dedicated person, they have a pool of resources that happens to be the same body count from the number of employees, but they come up with a theme that says, you know what, when I'm off, there's no backup for me. Or I don't know who the backup is unless I accidentally find out that, Shelley's not in the office. Well, I find out that she is going to be gone for 3 days. Well, who's the backup for her? And so what happens is they come up with a better way to source and cross-train themselves. So that would be another, theme. Communication, cross-training. It could be career pathing inside of an office could be another common theme that comes up, is that, I entered as an administrative assistant at Sunport, but I really love what it is that they're doing here from a medical standpoint. What are some other things I could be doing or should be doing inside of my role? So then they reorganize, and now you have entry level, which is the basin. So maybe it's, you don't have to have, a particular skill or educational point to come in, but then that basin becomes how you actually succession fill and career plan the rest of your office as your office grows, or you get multiple locations or what have you. So that's been another very common theme that usually comes up during a restructure is,
Right.
well, if I do this, well, am I always going to be doing this, or are there other going to, be other opportunities? So what are better way to do that? So career pathing is a common theme when you do
Mhm.
these restructures and change management. Putting together specific cross training is usually a typical theme for a task force, and communication is
Sure.
usually,
That does make
regardless
sense.
of company or structure, those things always come up.
Right, which does make sense. You'll find a lot of times in a clinical practice, sometimes you can get into these, it could be administrative or front desk, and then clinical's kind of on their own. So it can be this, kind of, sometimes there can be a little bit of rivalry, hopefully not, but they don't understand what I have to do. They don't. So having a task force that actually integrates some of those team members could be a really great thing.
It's a great way. Process and procedure is another common task force group too. It's that,
Okay.
the breakdown in communication is because we don't have a clear process. So to your point, clinical side and administration side is they may be working separately to
Mhm.
identify what their standard operating procedures are, but then at some point people have to come together to talk about, well, admin flows over to clinical on XYZ. Now clinical owns it, but at some point clinical's got to pass it back to the
Right.
administration side. So what does that look like? So often the miscommunication piece actually stems from the lack of processes, clarity, and consistency. And
Sure.
those task force members actually do it instead of a front office manager saying, this is how we do things around here.
Right. Right.
It's
Which,
another way to get at it.
yeah, I always encourage, we talk about roles, it's always like, we're all a cog on the wheel, and without one of us, we're not flowing. We don't have those processes in place, and we're not sort of moving along the way we need to you want to be sort of a well-oiled machine, but yet you have that whole personal touch, so,
Yes.
so always integrating that I think is really important. And I have to ask one more question. So at the end, your task force comes up with recommendations. What's the best way to manage it if they come up with some recommendations that the owner isn't
Can't do it.
necessarily comfortable with or can't actually follow through on? What's the
Yep.
best, is it just how to manage that?
No, it's another good one. So first of all, up front, I believe in doing some sort of a bylaws, if you will, or I call it a constitution. So
Mhm.
when the task force kicks off,
Yeah.
actually laying out, filling in the blank of, this is who's on the task force. This is the purpose of our task force. This is what happens when task force members don't show up and pull their weight. This is a
Mhm.
frequency in which we are going to meet. This is how we're going to communicate. And
Right.
how do we come up with agreements and disagreements? So those are some common things. But
Yeah.
inside of that would be an understanding that we know everything that we recommend is not going to be implemented.
Right. So setting
So
those ground rules.
yeah, that's the key thing. So that's up front. Coming back into the presentation, it's a great way to actually grow people into leadership as well, because running a task force group is a great way to tiptoe into supervisory management pieces, because it's amazing the exposure that they get working with teams and running teams.
Right.
So some side stuff. The other thing is that the lead would actually present to the owner,
Mhm.
these are our findings, these are our recommendations. And again, making it fact-based,
Right.
research study-based, if you will, versus how we feel.
Yeah.
So making it very business oriented, and that they know going in that they're going to have to present it from. And the other thing is, these are recommendations, and to be able to say, here's a pro and here's a con. If we do this, this is the outcome we're looking for. If we don't do that, this could happen. And then task force lead takes the easy way out. Here, Mr. or Mrs. Owner, you decide.
Right. Right.
So it makes it comfortable, and kind of on both sides.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned something, and I know you see this a lot, and I know I've seen it a lot too, is when you actually give that ownership to them, you're oftentimes just so pleasantly amazed at what comes out of it. And people who were just so quiet that you had no idea had a sincere interest in a particular topic, or who, just all of a sudden it just takes our confidence and it takes it to the next level. They are presenting that. It's just, to me, it's just this amazing, flower blossoming sometimes when you see people kind of just come into their own almost, and
Yes.
opens up a whole new flurry in your mind of things that they would be really great at and things that you might want to include them in, from a team perspective.
Yes, it definitely opens up the possibilities. It's amazing, like you said, when people blossom, um, instead of just coming in to pick up a paycheck which is just not true. The value of the seen, valued, and heard is just, the possibilities are crazy when we tap into people. That's what makes people stay at
Right.
work,
Yeah.
period. That's what creates that, that retention. So, I wanted to be clear on the whole change piece. The number one thing you have to do is acknowledge that change is hard, regardless of whether you love it, I love change, or whether it shuts you down. And the key is to talk about it first. And that's why I come back to that communication strategy, because acknowledging that we're going to be at different levels and different stages during change, because our momentum is simply different. It doesn't mean that our buy-in is different. It just means our momentum towards it is different. And the more we talk about it, the more comfortable we are about it. And it's easier to maneuver through the change.
Right.
And I also don't want to suggest that every change is smooth, because it's not. Change is
Mhm.
hard.
Right. And what I really like about what we've talked about today is that it's applicable whether you're a small solo practice with a select few people, or whether you're a large health system with multiple locations and multiple physicians and many layers of management, administration, and that sort of thing. The
Yes,
principles work and can be applied to any one of those settings.
absolutely. It's all scalable. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right, right. Any last tips before we go? I wanted to keep to our time frame today, but I could sit here and ask you lots more, but I won't. Um, any
No,
other tips?
I think it's just the fear, and that it's just have conversations. When change is about to happen, just have conversations with people, and start with your immediate circle of influence, and your comfort and your trust will grow, and then you'll know the course of action that you need to take. So
Right.
that's it. I
Yeah.
appreciate being on, and if people have questions, I'll be more than happy to follow up, but keep it simple and start with a communication strategy.
Right. I love that. How do that, if they wanted to reach out to you, how would they do so?
The easiest way is Shelley@premierrapport.com, and that is SHELLEY. And then Premier Rapport is PREMIERRAPPORT. And I'm all over social media, so I'm pretty easy to find.
I know I look forward to your posts every morning. They're really good.
Yay! Thank
So
you.
yeah. Yeah. So you will find Shelley out there, and I really appreciate your time today. And this is, like I say, it doesn't go away. It's here forever. Change is just a constant. So I love the tips for how to manage that best. So thank you so much.
Very welcome, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.